Well, sir, just before start, so I would like to acknowledge the invitation to give this talk on Tuesday evening. So when Neil offered me the chance to give this talk, so I was thinking, okay, Florence, end of June. I've been coming here for maybe 15 years. So this will be the topic, heat-related mortality. But can you see the weather? Thunderstorm. So okay. Anyway, I will talk about a project that we are now doing in Spain with a couple of colleagues from Valencia and Santiago de Compostela, developing a kind of application for monitoring the heat-related mortality in Spain during the summer. What is it? Here. So it seems today. Okay. So the current. So climate change has been recognized as probably one of the most important global threats for the human being during the 21st century. So the current climate conditions, they are already affecting health, but the projected conditions by the IPCC, they already show that the impact will be even higher, especially during summer because of the heat impact. 2022, it rise at the global scale more in average, almost 1 degree about the mean temperatures, which were calculated through the mid-20th century. So in fact, as far as I remember, 2022 has been the third most hot year in history since there are records, at least data from NOAA. But let's, before moving to the application, so let's talk a bit on when these studies on temperature-related mortality starts. So the modern studies, they appear in the mid-90s, just before or at the same time on the air pollution studies. And temperature exposure was a kind of secondary exposure within these studies. We were mainly focusing on the short-term effects of air pollution. And then once we finished the study, we used to try to somehow, I mean, in academia, it's just publish or perish. So we try to extend a set of secondary publications, mainly focusing on the effects of the temperature on health. So, but then arrives the European heat wave of 2003, and it was a game changer. So if you remember, during that summer, August was extremely hot. There were, at least the entire summer in most of the European countries, they were experiencing heat waves. Probably the most affected country in terms of mortality burden was France, with more than 15,000 deaths attributable to the heat wave. Then they were followed by, as far as I remember, more than 9,000, almost 10,000 in Italy, then 7,000 in Germany. In Spain, they were a bit more than 6,000. But then what did it happen with research? So since the European heat wave, then temperature become one of the most important, one of the hot topics in environmental epidemiology until nowadays. So if you try to check in PubMed, which is the number of publications trying to address somehow the effects of temperature and climate change, I mean, there is skyrocket. So it's probably one of the most popular exposure in environmental epidemiology nowadays. So what did it happen 2 years ago? So as I was mentioning, 2 years ago, worldwide was almost, in average, 1 degree above the reference period during the 20th century. But in Spain, it was even higher. It was more than 1.5 degrees. And it was the hottest year in history, since there are records for the past 100 years. So it was the hottest year ever. So on this plot looks like the anomalies. These anomalies, they mainly come during the summertime. So in June, there were 5 consecutive days exceeding the 95th percentile of the temperature distribution from the previous 10 years. It was the definition that we used to set as extreme temperatures. And July and August, they exceed almost one consecutive month. I mean, the last 2 weeks of July and the first 2 weeks of August, they were almost consecutively exceeding this threshold. So then at that time, I mean, the situation reminded me a lot what did it happen during the European heat wave in 2003. So then, jointly with these colleagues, so we decided just to write a research letter, so aiming for a kind of fast publication, trying to quantify which was the heat attributable mortality during the summer. So this research letter was published in Epidemiology in September, and we quantify that the mortality attributable to heat exposure was the same level that the one that we already experienced during the European heat wave of 2003. A few months later, but as far as I remember, by the end of the year, colleagues from IS Global, they did the same calculations, but for the entire Europe. And of course, well, thank God, so they got the same estimates from Spain, but they also checked that the estimates for all the European countries, they were very close as well to the ones that we already experienced to the European heat wave of 2003. So then it becomes last year, 2023. So 2023, in terms of anomalies, looked like 2022. The only difference is that we did not experience any, let's say, extreme temperatures in June, but there were almost 3 consecutive weeks from the beginning of July and from the beginning of August at the end of July. So then, at that time, we decided, okay, what shall we do? Shall we publish another research letter? Shall we do a larger paper? Of course, our CB, so we'll acknowledge these publications because eventually there are citations, there are a lot of clicks, your H index will rise up. Your institution will be happy because they are getting they will get a lot of citations as well. So it seems to be a win-win situation. But maybe it's because I'm too old. So we decide to do something different. So we decide just to transfer our knowledge to the society by developing a web-based, an online tool, just monitoring the health, the heat-related mortality in Spain. So we call it MACE because it's, the shortcut in Spanish for mortality attributable to heat in Spain. So in Spanish, it would be something, mortalidad atribuible por calor en España. This is the shortcut. And this application, at that time, last year, it was relatively simple because it was providing estimates at the nationwide level only that they are showing in this graph. So basically, we define 3 types of, 3 definitions for heat, and we calculate which was the heat mortality attributable under these three definitions that I will talk about in a minute. So this online tool is, it's quite easy. You only need to get access, you click in the current year, and you will get the estimates. So the user don't need to do anything. There's only one click. And of course, there is a kind of historical section that you can compare which, how much is the heat-related mortality this year compared with previous years. So how does it work? So let me go with the specifics on how does it work, this application. So the key point of this application is the monitoring mortality surveillance system in Spain. So in Spain, we have this mortality monitoring surveillance system, which is, I guess, is exactly the same in any other European country. But the main difference is that this data is open access. There is a 2 days delay, and you can get access to this data by province, age groups, and sex. So this mortality data mainly comes from, how do you call that in English? From the Ministry of Justice, from the courts. So each death is registered in these courts, that they were transferred to the Ministry of Justice, and then the Ministry of Justice transfers this information with 2 days delay to the Ministry of Health. And then, of course, the Ministry of Health updates this data into the monitoring surveillance system. Yeah? And anyone can get access. I mean, it's quite easy. I mean, the data is even in Excel format, can be downloaded, I mean, right now, if you would like to go to the MOMO system. So this MOMO system, MOMO is the shortcut for monitoring mortality surveillance, it was mainly aimed to develop the flu surveillance system in winter time. But the data is fully accessible all year long. And the data is on daily basis since 2015 up to 2 days ago. And, I mean, this is the key point. So this app, it's mainly developed in Shiny. Shiny is a language within R Studio that can be combined with R as well. So this app downloads the data every day at noon. So we program just to download the data when they upload the new mortality counts. Of course, we need the temperature. The temperature, once again, it's fully accessible. It's open access nowadays through the open data website from the Spanish Met Office. It also has a 2 days delay. So again, at noon, the system downloads the data. And since we already have the exposure and the response, so the only thing that we need to do is just to try to calculate the heat-related mortality through the exposure response function that it is very well known through the multiple Spanish studies that we have been working in. So most of these studies in Spain have been included in the multi-city, multi-country collaborative research network, which is the largest largest collaboration ever to address the health effects of any given environmental exposure. So nowadays, this MCC research network holds data from daily data for more than 1,100 cities in 55 countries. This is daily data that collects mortality, temperature, and air pollution. And of course, we are contributing with the data from the 52 capital cities in Spain since the beginning. So besides our local studies, we also have been contributing to the knowledge of the exposure response function in this multi-city study, which is using time series, I mean, state-of-the-art of time series regression. So this multi-city study is led by Antonio Gasparini, that will be here in 2 weeks. Well, in fact, maybe we'll visit here next Thursday because we are going out for dinner. And he will be talking about the methods that I will briefly summarize, because I encourage you, I mean, if you have time and interest in environmental epidemiology, I mean, this is the course which is describing nowadays the state of the art for the statistical and epidemiological methods. So then the only thing that we need to do, well, once again, the software does for us is just applies this exposure response function over the data, calculates the heat-related mortality, and displays through this Shiny application every day at noon the results in the website that I already showed you. So which are the methods that we are using to address for this exposure response function? So once again, we are using daily data, mortality counts, and average temperature. This data is analyzed with time series regression. Time series regression with distributed lag nonlinear models. So this is a special family of regression models which are very flexible, because it allows for nonlinear associations between mortality and temperature in our case, and also allows us to check for these nonlinear associations at different lags, different delay effects that may show different shapes. So the results that they are usually displayed in terms of this grid of mortality risk through temperature and the lag distribution. Of course, the results in terms of this 3D surface plot against the temperature and lag values, it's a bit complicated to produce an interpretation. So we tend to use the overall cumulative exposure response, which is basically with the net effect of the temperature over mortality across all the lags. It's like, I mean, we cannot do this now, but maybe in a few years. So it's like if we were pushing this plot through all the lags and we were getting the cumulative exposure response function. So here we are basically getting, which is the relative risk, which is centered at the point that we call the minimum mortality temperature. So it's the temperature in which the mortality is at minimum risk. And of course, since this curve is a curve of relative risk, for each given temperature for any given day, so for example, for 22 degrees, so this point is the relative, the mortality relative risk in a given day with 22 degrees. So we can transform this relative risk into an attributable fraction, and then the attributable fraction, when we multiply by the number of deaths in a given day at 22 degrees, we are getting the attributable numbers. So this is our estimate for the heat-related mortality for that temperature. And we can do this for any given temperature or under any given definition for heat. So, and this is the key point, how we define heat. So there is a kind of, through this extensive knowledge about the temperature mortality association, the usual definition for heat is mainly based on that we call the minimum mortality temperature approach. So this MMT approach, it's mainly based on centering our exposure response curve for the mortality risk in this temperature that we are calling once again, the ones which is at the minimum risk of mortality. And then we split our exposure response function like in two parts. The one that we call moderate heat and the one that we call extreme heat. And usually the threshold that has been used in most of the studies is the 95th percentile of the temperature distribution during the summer months. Yeah? So, however, these definitions based on this MMT approach, now I will show you, and now it shows a consistent, a kind of intuitive connection with the mortality risk, but not with the mortality burden. And we are interested in the mortality burden. So let's go through let me show you this intuitive connection through the mortality risk. So this is the MMT approach that I already mentioned, showing the exposure response function during the summer months. So we can get, which is the relative risk when we are for the maximum, for the entire heat definition, when we're comparing, which is the relative risk between the minimum mortality temperature and the maximum temperature. In this case is 1.4. Yeah? But we can do the same comparing or trying to get which is the relative risk, comparing the minimum mortality temperature with the relative risk at which we are setting our definition or threshold for extreme and moderate heat. That in our case, the moderate heat takes a value of 1.16. So can you see that intuitively we can derive which is the relative risk for extreme heat just by doing this ratio, which is 1.2. Yeah? But there is another way to analyze the data, which is reshaping our exposure response function, more than reshaping, recentering, just precisely at the value that we define as our threshold for extreme temperature. Here we are changing our counterfactual scenario. So we are changing all the assumptions. So we are assuming that at the 95th percentile of the temperature distribution in summer is the point that we are considering at minimum risk. That this could make sense because most of the heat health warning systems, most of the policies addressed to avoid deaths, that's due to heat exposure, are mainly active, are activated in those days that they are exceeding precisely the 95th percentile of the temperature distribution during the summer month. So most of the definitions for heat wave are mainly based on those days that they exceed. It could be mean temperature or maximum temperature or the combination of minimum and maximum, but it's mostly the 95th percentile. So, in other words, this is the target population for the policymakers, that they try to avoid premature death. So in that case, so we can calculate which is the relative risk between our new minimum mortality point, which is once again centered at the 95th percentile of the temperature distribution, and the maximum temperature, and it's exactly the same. Yeah, if you are interested in which is the relative risk for the extreme heat, so you can use both approaches. Yeah? But we're interested in the mortality burden. So we can do the same, but now using attributable deaths instead of relative, or of course they are coming from the relative risks. So these are the attributable deaths in the summer of 2022 in Spain for the entire definition of heat during summer, from June to August. There were nearby 15,000. These are the attributable deaths for moderate heat. Yeah, something like a bit more than 6,000, 6,700 almost. Yeah. So how much are the attributable deaths due to extreme heat? It's just the difference, 8,000. Yeah? So let's do the same using the percentile approach. If we run the percentile approach, how much do you think the attributable deaths will be? Yeah, this is what I thought in 2022, because I never tried before. There are only 3,000. Why? Because we are changing our counterfactual scenario. So here we are assuming that the minimum risk is at 16 degrees. But here we're assuming that the minimum risk is at a bit more than 26. So the attributable fraction, roughly, is the area under the curve of the relative risk. And intuitively, can you see that this area is much larger than this one? Yeah? So therefore, we already have the usual definition of moderate and extreme heat, but we need to give a new definition for this new type of heat that we want to calculate. So this heat is mainly identifying those days with intense heat, probably attributable to heat waves. So the heat exposure based on the MMT approach, even more, it may not represent what society understands by the heat effects, because the attributable deaths, they are quite large. They were for the entire summer, for the entire definition of heat, 15,000. For moderate heat, there were 6,000. For extreme heat, 8,000. And when population hears these huge numbers, in my experience talking with the media, they tend to don't believe. I will put you an example at the end of the talk. So the percentile approach, using this high percentile of the temperature distribution as a counterfactual scenario, allows us to define excess heat. And this excess heat can be understood as a subset, as a part of the extreme heat that mainly represents the add feature of the intensity of heat or during heat waves. So a bit more about technicalities, in case you're interested. This second version of our application mainly use a two-stage design. Once again, if you are coming in 2 weeks for Antonio's course, they will talk about the two-stage design. So the first stage tries to estimate which is the province-specific temperature mortality association using a time-stratified case crossover analyzed with conditional Poisson regression for the summer months between 2015 and just the year before the current one, because we don't want to get any kind of influence of the current temperatures. So we want somehow to predict which is going to be the heat-related mortality. Why since 2015? Because this is the first year that the monitoring mortality surveillance system is reporting data. And since we are using this data to calculate the heat-related mortality, so we want to use the exposure response function using this source of mortality. There is not big difference if you are using another mortality source. For example, the paper by our colleagues in IS Global, they did use weekly mortality counts from Eurostat, and they got almost the same results. Yeah? But since we don't want to get criticized by purists that they say, oh, you are using this source of mortality to estimate the heat-related, the heat attributable mortality during summer, but it's based in the exposure response function using another mortality source, so you were using exactly the same mortality source. As I mentioned, the temperature mortality association is modeling using DLNMs with lag effects up to 1 week, because we already know from this extensive evidence that the heat effects may last up to 1 week. And as I mentioned, the overall, so we use the overall cumulative relative risk for each day temperature to calculate the attributable deaths due to these three definitions: moderate, extreme, and excess heat as a part of the extreme heat. In the second stage, we derive the provincial, the regional, by regional, for those who are coming from Spain, it's the autonomous community, and the national heat-related mortality using multivariate meta-analysis with best linear unbiased predictions, with BLAPS estimates. As I mentioned, the extreme heat threshold is calculated based on the 95th percentile of the summer temperatures over the past 10 years, which is the most similar definition to the one which is using the Spanish heat wave warning system. The Spanish heat wave warning system uses almost the same definition, but not exceeding the mean temperature, but exceeding both at the same time, maximum and minimum. But if they exceed both maximum and minimum, of course, they will exceed the mean daily temperature, because the mean daily temperature is usually calculated as the mean between the minimum and the maximum. And the only problem is that there are like between 2 to 3 days delay in the data availability. So all the estimates that we are displaying, they have this delay. So these are the results that we experienced the last summer. So can you see, I mean, this first map, this is the map of Spain. Each of these sections represents the province, because the data, both mortality and temperature, is at the province level, is the minimum geographical aggregation that we can get access through the monitoring mortality surveillance system. So the extreme heat threshold, this 95th percentile of the temperature distribution in the summer month, mainly ranges between 22 and 34 degrees. I mean, depending on the region. Of course, you can imagine that the north is much cooler than the south or central Spain. I mean, for this reason, the threshold is much lower in the north and much higher in central Spain and the south of Spain. So these are the number of days that they exceed this threshold. This is the number of days that we define with extreme heat. That once again, they range between 4 and 28 days. There is a geographical variability with a clear north to south pattern. So let's go to the heat attributable mortality. So this first map refers to the moderate heat, the one which is below the 95th percentile. The second one is extreme heat, is the total mortality above the 95th percentile. And the last one, which is mainly displayed in red, is the heat mortality distribution for those days that we define as excess heat. Those days that they are mainly identifying heat waves or heat intensity. So as you can see, due to moderate heat, there were last summer around 5,000 heat-related attributable deaths due to moderate heat, 5,000 due to extreme heat, and among these, a bit less than a half, around 40%, they were in those days that the heat was much more intense, or maybe even heat waves. Yeah? And once again, this is the geographical distribution that you are getting here. So these maps are the counts in the same scale. So how does it look like, the heat attributable mortality since 2018 to the past year? Why since 2018? Because you need to remember that our mortality source starts in 2015. And we need at least 3 years of consecutive data to get a kind of consistent, robust exposure response function. So the results that we are getting here in 2018 are those that they were calculated with exposure response function with the data, with the mortality data between 2015 and 2017. So for 2019, we did use the data between 2015 and 2018, and then so on. So eventually, this year, we are using a 10-year period to get the exposure response function, because it will be between 2015 and 2020. No, we're in 2024. No, we will use 9 years, 2023. So next year, in 2025, so we will use 10-year period, and eventually we will move these 10-year windows, try to get the most accurate exposure response function, because from our extensive evidence, we already know that the slope for heat, it's nowadays being decreased because of adaptation of the population to the heat exposure. So, and once again, as you can see, comparing with the previous years, so 2022, so was the year with the largest heat attributable mortality in Spain. And these numbers, they are only comparable with the ones that we observed in the European heat wave of 2003. The second year, mainly affected by excess and extreme and excess heat, was last year, and then it was followed by 2018. So what else? So what this year, so as you are experiencing here, doesn't seem to be that hot. So now let me do an experiment. Let me check if we can, because the Wi-Fi, just when we were trying the slides and the presentation was down here, seems to be still down. So then let me use the, let me use the multimedia hand resources. Good. And now let's check if the landline works, which is the other point. Well, thinking. Well, the landline works, the Wi-Fi, it does not, but good. So this is how does it look like, the app right now. So of course it's in Spanish, so let's move it to English. Is it in English? Yeah. So here we can get the data for the current year. So in terms of national estimates, nowadays with the data update on June 21st, this is 3-4 days ago, there were already 1,500 deaths related to moderate temperature. Of course, since the graph is not showing red color or purple, so it means that we didn't reach yet any day above the threshold for extreme heat, and therefore we did not experience yet any day related with excessive heat. So you can also check how is the mortality nowadays attributable by each province. So this in terms of In terms of number of deaths, it seems that most of the deaths already occurred in central Spain. Of course, those who are familiarized with the Spanish geography, they will tell me, well, but the population may change quite substantially between provinces. So don't worry, we took into account that. So we can change to the mortality rate. And the mortality rate seems to be, of course, different pattern because it's accounting for the population. Yeah. So once again, seems to be central Spain. So if you go around, so this is a kind of interactive application. It will show you which is the number of deaths with the confidence interval, the number of days where the extreme heat threshold was exceeded, and which is the current extreme threshold that we are using in each province. And you can do exactly the same going to the historical records at the national level. So you will get the comparison that I already showed you in my slide. And now it's up to you, how do you want to play? Oops. So how do you want to run these comparisons? So for example, this is in 2023. So let us check, for example, something more excited, excessive heat in terms of mortality rates. It seems to be that mortality rate was relatively low in the most populated areas and much higher in central Spain, which is much less populated. And we can compare this, for example, with 2022, which is probably the pattern looks like pretty similar. So this is how the application works. I mean, it's quite easy to run, so you don't need to do basically anything. Just click which is the result that you want to display. Coming, good. And let's go here. Oops. Here. Oops. Not in this way. Because it's not replicating. So we are almost finishing. So let me come back. It's not duplicating. Okay.
Does it show, is it full screen?
Yeah. That one. Yeah, because it's not duplicating, it's extending the key. Okay. So, yeah, we were almost finishing. So just as a summary of this talk, so just combining let's say the ongoing research with the tools that we have nowadays for interactive data visualization and real-time analytics can provide a set of, we will be able to develop a kind of comprehensive platforms to monitor not only heat-related mortality, but in fact any given environmental exposure health-related related outcome. And these kind of platforms may be useful for public health preparedness or for policymakers just to take the appropriate decisions. I'm on record, so I will try to be polite. Because this is what is happening. So these are two news from the major, this is the major radio channel in Catalonia, in my region where Barcelona is, and this is the major newspaper in Barcelona. So let's go last year. Last year, let's say here, in August, mid-August, during the heat wave, they released this new. Of course, this one is in Catalan, you may not understand. So, but the city council, when heat wave comes, he has a warning system that they open during summer what they call climatic shelters, which is a fancy name for cooling centers. These centers, they are mainly schools, libraries, basically public buildings with air conditioning that they allow to people to get cooler if they don't have resources. So these guys from Radio Rack 1, so they checked that half of these climatic shelters, they were closed because they are public buildings run by public servants where in August they are on holidays. Because in Spain, everyone is on holidays in August. So most of the current climatic shelters that they were open, they were mainly public parks. Yeah, they have trees, maybe they have fountains, but I think it would be much better to get into a library with air conditioning. So this one is just fresh new from last week. So from last week, the Catalan government, they decide that they are going to close. So usually they shut down a given number of beds in the hospital during summer for economic reasons, because they don't have enough people just to run. But this year they decide, because they are running out of budget, that they will do these cuts in June, July, and August. Well, the media was all about this news. Of course, they promise that if you are having a kind of urgency, you will be attended. Yes, of course. But for those who are, anyone has been in Barcelona? So if you go to buy the Bron for an emergency without cuts, you may stay there for the entire day. So can you imagine with these cuts in June, July, and August? And these cuts, they will not affect only the main hospitals in the region. They will also affect to the primary care centers. They will reduce the activity by 80%. So you can get through the link and read the news. Anyway, so what else? Let's say from our point of view, for the blame to the environmental epidemiologists is that the definition that we are using for heat exposure should align somehow with the society expect in terms of risk, because we should be able to communicate this risk in a kind of in the most efficient way as possible, especially in the current climate change scenario, so that we are not experiencing here. But I'm pretty sure that next week you will experience, right? Because I checked the forecast. And here I have 3 consecutive news from the last year. So the first one is the usual new. The usual new is, once again, sorry, they are in Spanish. This first new usually refers to the heat stroke deaths. When there is a heat stroke death, it's all over the media. Oh, there is a guy who died by heat stroke. So this is in the newspapers, in the radio, even in TV. Usually, these heat stroke deaths, they are people working outside. Usually, workers belonging to the city council, because they used to be gardeners or people doing works in the buildings outside, that even working for the city council, they keep working instead of being inside as the city council suggests. And this news is kind of repetitive. There is once every 2 weeks, every 3 weeks. There are not too many, because heat stroke deaths heat stroke, it's a very weird mortality cause. And it may not be weird in Southeast Asia, because they are more aware about heat stroke, but in Southern Europe especially, so we are not really aware of heat stroke. So once we got one heat stroke death, it seems to be a kind of new that needs to be reported in all the media. So this is one death only. So then there is the news that they were referring our application, reporting this kind of 2,000 deaths in 2023 due to extreme heat, due to excess heat. The one that was identifying the most intense heat days or heat waves. At the news, they were reporting like 2,000 deaths at that day. Of course, the society, when they tend to think on which is the heat-related mortality, immediately it pops to their mind heat stroke. Heat stroke is probably the only mortality cause, which is in its own definition, it has the exposure. So they compare 1 versus 2000. And then this is the news from our colleagues, referring the paper of our colleagues in IS Global. So they were reporting 11,000, but this 11,000 was for the entire heat definition during June, July, and August. So these are 3 different definitions of the exposure and the health outcome. And of course, when the people, they read that there were 11,000 deaths in Spain related to heat exposure, I mean, no one believed this. And I can tell you, because when I tried to report, to communicate this value with the media, the journalists say, huh? And where are these deaths? I mean, mainly they are older people with some kind of cardiovascular respiratory pathology that the heat or the hot temperatures, they work as a trigger. Yeah? But the people, they keep thinking in heat stroke. Heat stroke is super weird in any country, unless, once again, if you are going to the Southeast Asia. So we recently published a study using heat stroke deaths in Spain, and in average there are 10 per year, countrywide. In Japan, there are 700. Because they are aware about the diagnosis. So they have an ambulance call heat-related system. So this is an ambulance system only for heat calls. So you can only call this number if you are getting symptoms of heat stroke. You cannot get to this number if you are getting any other symptom. So I guess, under my experience, that probably it would be when you are talking with the media, try to report something intermediate related to the extreme exposure, to the one that the public, the policymakers, they try to avoid, which are, of course, those who are related with excess heat, more associated with the most intense hot days and heat waves. So finally, there is still room for improvement. So using new tools to predict heat attributable mortality by using real-time data. So now the problem with this application, well, the limitation with this application is that it has these 2 to 3 days delays, mainly related to the data source. Of course, we can solve this problem for the exposure, because we can use, instead of the observed temperatures, we can use the predicted temperatures. So today, any Met Office is giving the predictions, so you can check your phone, for tomorrow up to 1 week, in a kind of accurate way. So you can experience this. But how can we use this to predict the mortality if we don't have the outcome? So the outcome, we want to predict them. So we can move a step forward in our statistical analysis. So it's something that we will see this on Thursday, when Con is explaining the dose response, how to analyze dose response associations. So this is the exposure response function that we are using in environmental epidemiology studies to address for the short-term effects of temperature. It's mainly a curve based on relative risks. But where does this curve come from? It comes from the predicted death counts, the predicted mortality counts from our regression model. And what are we doing with these predicted counts? So we identify which is the mortality which is the temperature that predicts the minimum mortality, the point that I already defined as minimum mortality temperature. And this is our reference baseline value. And then we divide all the predictions over this value to get the relative risk exposure response function using this MMT approach. So in other words, instead of using our exposure response function based on the relative risk, we go back. So we do one step back and come to the predicted death counts. So we only need to get, which is the forecast for tomorrow. Tomorrow will be here much hotter, so 25. So we go up, and then we got the predicted deaths jointly with the confidence interval. So nowadays, we are collecting all the predictions every day in Spain, because the problem is that it requires a large amount of memory, because every day the predictions change up to 1 week. To compare how much we will deviate doing these predictions based on the real counts, on the real heat-related mortality that we are currently reporting with this application. So if anyone is interested, we publish how the application works in this humble journal called Environment and Health, mainly because the editor invited us, is a colleague of us, that he invited us just to publish this in his journal. And this is the team, which is mainly led by Dominic Roy, who is the head of data science and the Climate Research Foundation. And of course, maybe some of you may know Carmen. Carmen Niñiguez is a statistician, associate professor at the Department of Statistics and the University of Valencia. And of course, here I am. And that's good enough. It was everything. So thanks for your attention in this talk.